Just a resource drain we can't justify. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 40 minutes before Margaret Walsh cracked open a child's chest with her bare hands. Cedar Creek Medical's pediatric wing smells like industrial antiseptic and desperation at 2 a.m., fluorescent lights humming over bleached tile floors like insects trapped in glass. Margaret Walsh, 58, moves through the night shift checking vitals on sleeping children, her grey hair pulled into a regulation bun so tight it could draw blood, her hand steady on bedrails and 4 lines and the small shoulders of kids who shouldn't be here. 3 years at Cedar Creek. 3 years of night shifts. 3 years of being the kind of nurse doctors barely noticed until they needed something, a catheter placed on the 3rd try, a medication tracked down at 3 in the morning, a family member calmed down before they called security. The kind of nurse people looked through instead of at. She checks the saline drip in room 341. Adjusts the blanket in room 343. Her movements are efficient, economical, the body language of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. The tremor in her left hand, old injury, shrapnel from a place she never talks about, only shows when she's completely still. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket is tarnished silver, worn smooth by decades of fingers pressing it for luck, and Margaret touches it unconsciously as she moves between rooms, a habit she cannot break even after all these years of trying. Room 347 is different. She knows this before she opens the door. The room holds 8-year-old Ethan Hartley, admitted 6 hours ago after a diving accident at a neighborhood pool. The pediatric bed seems too big for him, or maybe he seems too small for it. The distinction blurs when you're looking at a child whose spine was severed at CF by a fiberglass slide that should have been removed 2 summers ago. The ventilator breathes for him now, a mechanical wheeze that fills the space like a second heartbeat. His eyes are open. Children's eyes shouldn't hold that kind of awareness, that terrible understanding that their body no longer belongs to them. Commander James Hartley sits in the plastic visitor's chair beside his son's bed, and he is the kind of broken that doesn't announce itself. No visible wounds. No blood. Just a man whose edges have been softened and then re-solidified into something harder and colder than it was before. Unshaven jaw. Eyes that haven't blinked in hours. The uniform he wore to the ER is still on him, creased and sweat-stained, his Navy SEAL insignia catching the fluorescent light. He's holding Ethan's hand, the only part of his son he can touch without causing pain. Margaret pauses at the doorway. Just for a half second. Just long enough for something to flicker across her face, recognition, maybe, or the ghost of it. Her jaw tightens imperceptibly. Her hand moves toward the challenge coin in her pocket, then stops. She takes a breath that no one else hears, and when she steps into the room her expression is completely blank again, professional, the face of a night shift nurse who has seen worse and will see worse before dawn. "Evening, Commander," she says quietly. "I'm Margaret. I'll be checking on Ethan through the night." She does not say his name the way doctors say it. She says it like she has earned the right to use it. Hartley's eyes focus on her for the first time in what might be days. Something shifts in his face. Not recognition, not exactly, but the awareness that he is being seen by someone who understands that a Navy SEAL holding his paralyzed son's hand is not a moment for small talk or false hope. He nods. Does not speak. The communication happens in that single exchange, the way it happens between people who have occupied the same dangerous spaces and live to tell about it, even if they've never met before in their lives. Margaret checks the ventilator settings. 14 breaths per minute. FiO2 at 0.6. The endotracheal tube is secure in Ethan's throat, taped with the kind of precision that comes from having placed hundreds of them. She checks the 4 fluids, a 20 gauge in his left arm, saline running wide open, because a child with spinal trauma needs aggressive fluid resuscitation to prevent cascade failure. She does all of this with her hands moving on muscle memory, the kind of automatic competence that comes from 23 years of doing this work, from 17 of those years doing it in places where mistakes killed people in seconds instead of hours. "Has anyone talked to you about what happens next?" she asks, though she already knows the answer. Hartley's silence is answer enough. "Dr. Caldwell will be here for morning rounds at 6 a.m., Margaret says. He's the attending physician for pediatric trauma. She does not add anything else. She does not say, he will look at your son and see a resource drain. She does not say, he has triage protocols that favor patients with positive prognosis, which means he has already decided your son is not worth aggressive intervention. She does not say, I have seen this calculation before, on clipboards and in quiet conversations in hallways, and the patients who survive are always the ones whose families make noise or whose doctors believe in them enough to fight back. Instead, she checks Ethan's pupils, reactive, equal, round, and makes note of his pain level and his anxiety level and the fact that he has not cried since they admitted him, which is worse than if he had. A child should cry. Crying means the child still believes things might change. By the time Dr. Caldwell arrives for morning rounds at 6:02 a.m., 13 minutes later than his scheduled time, because he had stopped to take a call from hospital administration about bed capacity, the pediatric wing has begun to stir. Day shift nurses arrive like a changing of the guard. Families begin to shuffle in with coffee and exhaustion written on their faces. Margaret hands off her notes to Emily Chen, the day shift charge nurse, a woman 15 years younger who still believes that medicine is about helping people instead of managing metrics. Dr. Caldwell stands in the hallway outside room 347, his tablet already glowing with data, his white coat crisp and immaculate, his presence somehow making the corridor seem narrower. He is the kind of doctor who was born with confidence like a trust fund, the kind that comes from having never experienced doubt or failure or the sensation of being powerless in front of suffering. He is flanked by residents, 2 of them, eager and note-taking and ready to absorb whatever wisdom their attending might impart about resource allocation and triage protocols. Hartley case, Caldwell says, not a question. He swipes through the chart with the casual efficiency of someone reviewing a spreadsheet. C's for transection. Ventilator dependent. Irreversible. He does not enter the room. He does not look at Ethan or at Commander Hartley sitting vigil in that plastic chair. He makes his assessment from the hallway, filtered through data, translated into mathematics. This is, Caldwell continues, what we need to discuss. He turns to address the residents gathered around him, his voice carrying down the hall with the natural authority of a man who has never needed to raise it. Unsalvageable cases. Resource drains we can't justify. We have 52 pediatric beds at Cedar Creek. We have approximately twice that in patients currently waiting for placement. This child will require full-time ventilator support, ongoing specialized nursing care, aggressive physical therapy with minimal probability of recovery. He will occupy a bed that could be used for patients with realistic positive prognoses. This is not medicine. This is resource mismanagement dressed up as compassion. One of the residents scribbles notes. The other nods, absorbing this lesson like it is something to build a career on. Margaret hears this from across the hall, where she is finishing her charting at the nurse's station. She does not stop writing. She does not look up. She finishes the sentence she is writing, vital sign stable, patient alert and oriented, father at bedside, and sets her pen down with the kind of careful precision that suggests she is managing something much larger than a pen. Emily Chen, the day shift nurse, lowers her voice. He's going to recommend comfort care instead of aggressive intervention. Margaret does not respond. She gathers her things. She stands. She moves past Dr. Caldwell and his cluster of residents with the kind of invisibility that comes from being a night shift nurse on a day shift ward, the kind of person you forget is there the moment she leaves. But in room 347, as she walks past, she makes eye contact with Commander Hartley one more time. Just for a second. The contact communicates something that words would only diminish. I see you. I understand what you're facing. I have been in dark places too, and there are people who survive them because someone refuses to write them off. Hartley sees her. Understands her. In that moment, in the fluorescent light of a hospital corridor in San Diego, a Navy SEAL commander and a night shift nurse recognize each other as veterans of invisible wars. Dr. Caldwell does not see this exchange at all. He is already moving to the next room, the next calculation, the next patient whose survival probability does not justify the expense of keeping them alive. Grand rounds at Cedar Creek Medical happened every Tuesday at 7 in the morning in the amphitheater-style conference room on the 3rd floor, where the fluorescent lights hummed with the certainty of institutional power. Dr. Caldwell stood at the podium with Ethan Hartley's chart open on the projection screen, his voice carrying the measured confidence of a man who'd never been questioned successfully. 12 residents sat in tiered seating, notebooks open, pens ready, the architecture itself designed to make the man at the bottom feel smaller than the men above him. "This case presents an excellent teaching moment," Caldwell said, clicking to Margaret's documentation. "A patient with cervical spinal cord injury, complete transaction at CR4, zero neurological recovery prognosis, and a family unwilling to accept medical reality." He paused, letting that sink in. "But the real pathology we're examining today is professional boundary failure." Another click. Margaret's handwriting filled the screen, 3 separate consult requests, detailed notes on Ethan's cardiac response to stimulation, a timeline of vital sign deterioration she'd flagged as inconsistent with passive decline. "Nurse Walsh," Caldwell continued, his tone suggesting he was discussing a lab specimen rather than a colleague standing 3 rows down, "has requested neurology, cardiology, and rehabilitation consults for a patient with less than 5% viability. This is what we call the Florence Nightingale complex, the belief that compassion supersedes probability, that emotional involvement trumps evidence-based medicine." He turned slightly toward the residents. "Watch carefully. This is how burnout in geriatric nursing staff manifests. They begin to see patients as rescue missions rather than clinical problems requiring triage allocation." Margaret's jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in her cheek, visible to anyone watching. Her hands hung loose at her sides, perfectly still, the kind of stillness that comes from having spent years in rooms where any movement might be misinterpreted as threat or panic. Her breathing stayed even, measured, the same rhythm she'd used in the back of a CH-53K King Stallion during a medical evacuation from Helmand Province with 2 rounds of SAF fire coming through the fuselage. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Raw restraint wrapped around bone and held in place by 18 years of muscle memory. Caldwell clicked to another slide, a comparison chart showing Margaret's case management history against his, her consultation requests mapped like a trail of professional misbehavior. "Notice the pattern," he said to the residents, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, heavy and deliberate. "Emotional involvement increases proportionally with case difficulty. The more hopeless the prognosis, the more heroic measures this staff member attempts to authorize." He zoomed in on one entry. Here, she recommended palliative care with active monitoring. Here, she documented what she calls inconsistent deterioration pattern. This is not nursing. This is projection. The residents wrote faster. One of them glanced at Margaret, then quickly looked away. Another didn't look up at all. At 3:36 that afternoon, Margaret stood in front of the vending machine on the ground floor of Cedar Creek Medical, feeding quarters into the slot with methodical precision. Behind her, at the coffee station, 2 interns were discussing the morning's grand rounds with a kind of careless certainty that only came from never having your judgment questioned by someone with authority. "Did you see Caldwell roast that old lady in rounds?" one of them said, laughing. His name was something, Marcus, maybe. He had the kind of face that suggested he'd never been denied anything significant. "Granny Walsh thinks she knows better than an MD," the other one said. "Bet she learned medicine from Grey's Anatomy or something." The laughter carried across the lobby like fingernails on tile. Margaret selected black coffee, the machine hissing as it dispensed the cup. She turned without looking at either in turn, walked toward the elevator with the cup in her hand, her expression completely neutral. The kind of neutral that could mean nothing, or could mean everything, depending on who was reading it. She didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge them at all. Her composure was a weapon they didn't know she was carrying. That evening, she approached Dr. Caldwell's office on the 4th floor. His door was open. He was typing something on his computer, his back to her, his office the kind of space that announced rank through careful curation, framed credentials from Johns Hopkins, a photograph with a state senator, a Crystal Award for Healthcare Innovation Leadership. Margaret knocked once on the doorframe, quiet and measured. Caldwell didn't turn around. "Yes?" "I'd like to request a second opinion consult on the Hartley case," Margaret said. Her voice was steady, professional, the voice of someone asking for something reasonable and necessary. "Neurology has availability tomorrow morning at 8. I believe." "No." Caldwell didn't stand. Didn't turn. Just said the word into his computer screen like it was a clinical diagnosis he'd already decided on. When he finally swiveled his chair to face her, his expression was the kind of calm that belongs only to people with absolute institutional power. "Nurse Walsh, if you question my clinical judgment one more time, security will escort you from this facility. Are we clear?" His voice carried into the hallway outside his office. Margaret could hear the shift in ambient noise as people pretended not to listen while absolutely listening. A resident walked past slowly. A cleaner stopped pushing her cart. "Your role is to execute orders," Caldwell continued, standing now, moving closer to her in the way that people with institutional power sometimes did. "Not to generate them. Not to second-guess them. Perhaps you've forgotten the hierarchy here at Cedar Creek Medical." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, and in that moment she saw exactly what he was. A man who'd never been tested by anything that mattered. Who'd never held someone's spine together with his hands while incoming fire stripped the sandstone walls apart. Who'd never learned the difference between the kind of strength that comes from hierarchy and the kind that comes from having already lost everything you could afford to lose. "No," Margaret said quietly. "I remember." She turned and walked back down the corridor toward the pediatric ward, her badge clipped to her lanyard, her scrub soft with age and repeated washing. No one tried to stop her. Commander Hartley was sitting in the chair beside Ethan's bed when she entered the room. His son was sleeping, medicated into a space where pain wasn't applicable, where consciousness was a mercy rather than a necessity. The commander's hands were empty on his lap, palms up like a question he already knew the answer to. Margaret pulled the tarnished challenge coin from her scrub pocket, the same one Hartley had pressed into her hand 18 years ago after their team had held the compound at Sanjin Valley for 16 hours under sustained fire, when the rotation was meant to be 6 hours and the relief had been pinned down by SAF positions on 3 sides. The coin had her unit insignia worn smooth from handling, from being carried through years she'd been told never to discuss, through operations that had been erased from official record, through a transition into civilian identity that felt less like a new life and more like a careful burial. She placed it on Ethan's tray table without speaking. Commander Hartley looked at the coin. Looked at it for a long moment, the kind of moment where recognition works its way through grief and confusion and arrives at something like understanding. His eyes came up to meet hers. "You were there," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact moving into memory. The compound. Helmand. 16 hours. Margaret didn't confirm or deny it. She'd been trained in how to survive interrogation, and confirmation of anything was a form of weakness. Instead she adjusted Ethan's intravenous line, checked the flow rate, verified the oxygen saturation reading on the monitor beside his bed. Everything was normal. Everything was degrading. Everything was exactly as Dr. Caldwell had planned for it to be. "Will my son make it through the night?" the commander asked quietly. Margaret looked at the monitor. At the 4 running clear into Ethan's small arm. At the machines in the room working on their own logic, indifferent to the hierarchy of Cedar Creek Medical, indifferent to orders that said comfort measures only, indifferent to the challenge coin now sitting on a plastic tray table between a paralyzed child and a father who'd once been told that certain people never left the people they'd promised to protect. "I made a promise once," Margaret said. Her voice was different now. Not the deferential voice of the night shift nurse. Something older. Something that had learned patience in the desert where patience meant the difference between holding a position and losing it. Made it in the dust. To a man whose team held the line when everything was fire and noise. "I told him we don't leave people behind." The commander went very still. "Doesn't matter if they're in a uniform or a hospital bed," Margaret continued. "Doesn't matter if the metrics say they're unsalvageable. Some promises transcend orders." At 1:16 a.m., Ethan Hartley's heart began its final failure. The monitor alarm screamed through the quiet of the pediatric ward like a warning that came too late. Margaret was there already, the kind of already that suggested she'd been waiting, expecting, prepared. She hit the code button with one hand and had her fingers on the small boy's chest with the other, beginning compressions with the muscle memory of 1,000 field saves, the kind of memory that doesn't come from textbooks or nursing school. Commander Hartley pressed himself against the far wall of the room, watching his son's body lift and fall with each compression, watching the woman he'd known as something other than a nurse move through the choreography of resuscitation with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this when the alternative was leaving people behind and watching them become statistics. The night resident, still half asleep, stumbled into the room. Margaret ordered directly, 14-gauge angiocath, line in the left arm, push 1 mg epinephrine 4. The resident moved without questioning her, the kind of obedience that comes when someone speaks with absolute certainty about what comes next. 3 rounds of defibrillation. No rhythm. 5 minutes. 7 minutes. The monitor stayed flat, accusing. The resident reached for the phone to call time of death, his hand moving slowly like it was something he'd done before, something that had never felt worse. But Margaret wasn't finished. Not even close. 11 o'clock at night. The pediatric monitoring station glowed with 6 screens, each one a heartbeat, each one a story Cedar Creek's day's shift had decided was already over. Margaret pulled the chair closer to Ethan Hartley's cardiac monitor, the vinyl creaking like old bones. 6 hours. That's how long the degradation had been visible on the telemetry strips if anyone had bothered to look. She had bothered. She always did. The boy's ejection fraction was dropping. The dysrhythmia patterns weren't random noise, they were a conversation, and she'd learned to speak that language in Helmand Province when the difference between reading a monitor and missing the signs meant whether someone went home or went home in a flag-draped box. The trajectory was clear as a rifle sight. Complete rhythm failure by dawn. Maybe earlier if the night held its breath just right, if the machines decided to stop pretending he had time. Dr. Caldwell's orders were explicit, comfort care only. No resuscitation. No aggressive intervention. The chart read like a death sentence written in medical jargon, and the official protocol was designed to make sure that sentence carried out silently, efficiently, without anyone having to actually watch a child die. The hospital would note that everything possible had been done. The hospital would be lying. Margaret had worked night shifts at Cedar Creek for 3 years, invisible enough that the day staff never remembered her name, competent enough that they called for her when the evening nurse couldn't find a vein. Now she sat in the dark at 11:02 p.m. and made a calculation that would unravel everything. She could follow protocol. She could let Caldwell win. She could disappear back into the life she'd been ordered to live, just another nurse, just another set of quiet hands, just another person no one needed to know about. Or she could stay. The decision didn't feel like a decision. It felt like remembering who she was. Like the mask slipping off her face and hitting the tile floor with a sound nobody heard. She pulled the chair directly beside Ethan's bed, moved the four-stand, positioned herself where she could see his chest rise and fall, see the color of his lips, feel the room's temperature change if something shifted. She had promised his father something 18 years ago in a compound in Helmand Province. She had promised that if it mattered, she wouldn't leave him behind. She hadn't promised to stay alive. She hadn't promised to keep her career. Commander Hartley was asleep in the chair by the window, his head tilted back at an angle that would give him a neck sprain by morning. Margaret didn't wake him. Some men needed to rest before they understood that rest was over. The clock moved. 1:15 a.m. 1:33 a.m. The monitor beeped its mechanical rhythm, steady now but hollow, a performance, not a promise. Margaret's hands rested on her thighs, her jaw so still it could have been carved from stone. She wasn't afraid. Fear was for people with options. She was something else entirely, a woman who had already died once, who had been buried in classified files and erased from the official record, who had nothing left to lose except the one thing she'd come to Cedar Creek to find. Purpose. Meaning. The chance to be the person she actually was instead of the ghost she'd been ordered to become. 2:22 a.m. The first spike hit the monitor like a gunshot. Ethan's rhythm didn't just degrade, it shattered. Ventricular fibrillation, the heart seizing, the electrical system misfiring into chaos. Margaret moved. No hesitation. No call button. Hands on the boy's sternum. Compressions, hard and fast, the rhythm automatic, 1 and 2 and 3 and. The speed of muscle memory. The precision of someone who had done this in dust storms and gunfire and darkness when stopping meant dying. Commander Hartley woke. His eyes went wide. He didn't move. He knew better than to move. Margaret's voice was flat as concrete. Get Dr. Chen. Code Blue. Tell him to bring the crash cart. Now. The command in her voice made the commander stand without processing why. He moved like a man under orders from someone whose authority he recognized. The hallway, the nurse's station, she heard his voice cut through the quiet. Code Blue, Pediatric ICU, Ethan Hartley's room. Now. 3 minutes. That's how long it took for Dr. Chen to arrive, the night resident, 28 years old, 3 months into his tenure at Cedar Creek, still thinking that protocols existed for reasons other than liability. He stood in the doorway with the crash cart, watching Margaret's hands move with the fluid precision of apex predators, efficient, purposeful, unstoppable. Compression started at 2:02, Margaret said. No room for question in her voice. Just information. No spontaneous rhythm. I'm at 4 minutes continuous. Dr. Chen wheeled the defibrillator closer, began opening the paddles. Standard procedure. By-the-book response. Margaret's hands never stopped. The compressions were perfect, hard enough to circulate blood, fast enough to demand the heart remember its job. The monitor showed only chaos. Flatline waves, then fibrillation, then flatline again. The body's electrical system had lost the plot entirely. Push 1 milligram epi, Margaret said. Command, not request. Her voice had dropped an octave somewhere in the last 4 minutes. It sounded like a voice that had given orders in compounds and command centers, not hospital rooms. Dr. Chen hesitated. Caldwell said. I'm aware what Caldwell said. Push the epi. 8 minutes without established rhythm and his perfusion is still adequate because compressions never stopped. We continue. 6 minutes. 7. The monitor flickered, some kind of electrical activity, barely organized, a heart trying to remember how to beat. Dr. Chen had started checking his watch. Margaret saw the calculation happening in his face. Protocol said 8 minutes. Protocol said stop. Protocol said let the child die and file the paperwork and tell the parents his brain had already gone. 8 minutes exactly. Dr. Chen stepped back from the monitor. That's protocol, he said. His voice cracked. He was a good resident. She could see it. He didn't want to do this either. You're a nurse. That's not your call. 8 minutes, no rhythm, we follow the code. Get the thoracotomy tray, Margaret said. Same tone. Same absolute authority. Now, Dr. Chen. He stared at her. That's not your call, you're a nurse. Get the thoracotomy tray. Each word separate. Each word a command that bypassed his hesitation and spoke directly to the part of his brain that recognized rank, that understood there were moments when protocol became a shroud and the only moral choice was mutation, was breaking, was becoming something other than obedient. He moved. Training overrode judgment. He was back 3 minutes later with the sterile tray, the instruments gleaming under the overhead lights like surgeons' intentions. Margaret's hands didn't stop compressions. Commander Hartley stood in the doorway, white-knuckled, his presence filling the room like a man remembering what it felt like to lead. This is insane, Dr. Chen whispered. You'll lose your license. Margaret prepped the chest with her free hand. Antiseptic. The smell of it sharp and bright, cutting through the stale hospital air. She felt the rise and fall of Ethan's sternum under her palms, felt the desperate mechanical pumping of compressions that were buying time, buying possibility, buying the chance for a child to wake up and remember his own name. "I already lost everything that mattered," Margaret said. She said it like someone reporting weather. Like a simple truth with no weight behind it, and Dr. Chen understood in that moment that he was standing next to someone for whom this choice cost nothing because she'd already paid the price 18 years ago in Helmand Province. The incision was precise. Skin. Fascia. The muscles of the chest wall yielding to someone who knew exactly where to cut, how deep, what came next. Muscle memory. Field surgeries. The kind of medicine they teach at the combat medic school at Fort Sam Houston, and the kind of medicine you never forget, even when you're supposed to. Especially when you're supposed to. She spread the ribs. The sternum came open like a book she'd read before. And there was his heart. The organ was barely moving, barely trying. Margaret's hand went into the chest cavity, found the heart, and began direct cardiac massage. No instruments. No technical distance. Just her hand on his heart, pumping it, willing it, demanding it understand what beating meant. The muscle was warm. It was real. It was his small child's heart in her palm, and she was a Master Chief Petty Officer who had held lives together in the dark for longer than this boy had been alive. Come on. Come on. Come on. The heart fluttered. Once. Irregular. A single beat that might have been reflex. Twice. Stronger. Something like intention. The monitor chirped. Then it steadied. The electrical system found its groove, found the rhythm, found the will to keep going. Sinus rhythm. The words appeared on Dr. Chen's face before he said them, the realization that this child, this supposedly unsalvageable child, was going to live. Margaret kept pumping, kept pushing, kept holding the heart until it was strong enough to hold itself. 30 seconds. 40. The color returned to Ethan's lips. His oxygen saturation climbed. 67, 71. 78, 85. The numbers climbing like a prayer being answered. Only then did she remove her hand. Only then did she begin closing with sutures that would have impressed a cardiothoracic surgeon at Johns Hopkins, hand steady as the hands of someone who had sewn human beings back together in conditions where steadiness meant survival. The silk moved through the tissue like music. The sternum closed. The ribs came together. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, done it in rain and blood and darkness and gunfire, done it when the only light came from muzzle flashes and the only assistance came from people who understood that failure meant body bags. Dr. Chen watched her hands work. His mouth was open. He was realizing something that Margaret had always known, that there were different kinds of expertise, that a nurse could be something the hospital never suspected, that the woman who changed bedpans and checked vitals might be the most dangerous person in Cedar Creek Medical. She tied the final suture. The work was done. "Call Dr. Caldwell," Margaret said. Her voice had returned to normal. "Just information. Just a nurse reporting her findings. Tell him exactly what happened. Tell him his unsalvageable patient is now in stable sinus rhythm with adequate perfusion. Tell him I performed open cardiac massage and that his child is going to live. Tell him I'm not finished." That last part hung in the air like a threat. But it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The silence in the room lasted 3 seconds. Then the monitor's rhythmic beeping filled it back in, the sound of a child's heart remembering how to beat, the sound of protocol being broken and a boy being saved, the sound of a woman becoming herself again for the first time in 18 years. Commander Hartley stood in the doorway with tears on his face and the tarnished challenge coin pressed against his heart and said nothing at all, because there were no words for what he was witnessing. His son was alive. The woman who had promised never to leave him behind had kept her word. And the hospital that had decided to let them both disappear was about to understand exactly what it meant to come against the person who had been ordering him to stay erased. The monitor's steady beat became a wheeze. Then nothing. Ethan's chest wall went still at 2:04 a.m., his small frame swallowed by sheets that suddenly felt like a shroud. The oxygen saturation numbers on the display began their descent: 94, 92, 89, each digit a countdown Margaret had memorized across 23 years of keeping people alive in rooms where the machines couldn't do the work alone. Dr. Chen burst through the doors, already calling for the crash cart, already running through protocols designed for children who still had options. Margaret didn't step back. She moved to the bedside, hand steady as surgical lasers, and began chest compressions on the 8-year-old's fragile ribcage. Her fingers found the landmarks, the xiphoid process, the midline, and her compressions had the precise rhythm of someone who had performed them on soldiers bleeding out in the dust of Helmand province, where the difference between life and death was measured in seconds and the pressure of your own hands. "He's not coming back with compressions," she said quietly, not looking up. "His rhythm is asystole. His output was already compromised. Protocol tells you to continue for 20 minutes and call it. Protocol doesn't account for field salvageable cases." "We follow the standard of care," Dr. Chen replied, his voice tight. He was young, competent within the narrow corridors of textbook medicine, the kind of doctor who believed that rules existed to protect patients rather than to bury them. "He's been down for 6 minutes. "No," Margaret said. "He's been circling the drain for 3 days while we watched. 6 minutes is just when his heart finally stopped asking for help." She didn't break rhythm. Her compressions continued with the mechanical perfection of muscle memory: push, release, the way she'd performed them on IED casualties with their chests open to the Afghan air, keeping organs perfused until a surgeon could do the work that mattered. The resident moved for the defibrillator pads. Margaret shook her head. "Asystole won't respond to shock. You know this." Her eyes met Chen's across the small body between them. "Get me a scalpel. Left anterolateral approach. 4th intercostal space. I can establish direct cardiac massage if you're willing to stop following protocol and start following the boy who's dying." "You can't perform surgery," Chen said. "I can perform what's necessary," Margaret replied. No apology in her voice. No request. The distinction between the two hung in the recycled air of the pediatric ICU like the smell of antiseptic and fear. The silence lasted 1 second. Then Chen moved. He didn't ask credentials or authorization. He'd worked alongside enough combat veterans to recognize the tone of someone who wasn't offering an opinion, someone who was stating a fact the way soldiers state coordinates to fire support. He grabbed the surgical tray. Margaret's hands moved before her mind could calculate the breach she was about to cross. The scalpel felt right in her grip, the weight of it familiar in a way that nothing else at Cedar Creek Medical could ever feel. The blade slid through skin with the whisper of a sigh, and beneath that initial surface was the fascia, pale and precise, and beneath that was the space she needed. She could smell the copper of blood, the sharp tang of exposed tissue, and somewhere in the reptile part of her brain that had been forged in operating tents and field hospitals, muscle memory took over completely. Her hands moved on their own. The rib retractor came next, spreading the intercostal space with a low click that sounded like a soldier chambering around. Her fingers found the pericardium, that tough sac surrounding the heart, and the scalpel opened it with surgical precision. Ethan's heart lay exposed, pale and still, no longer beating on its own. Margaret's hand entered the boy's chest cavity. Her fingers wrapped around the ventricle. And she began direct cardiac massage, feeling the weight of the organ in her palm, squeezing it with the exact pressure that would push blood to the brain without tearing tissue that was already traumatized. Push, release, push, release. The rhythm of survival. The beat she'd learned to perform on soldiers in Sanjin Valley when defibrillation had failed, and the difference between giving up and pushing harder meant someone's kid got a funeral or a homecoming. "Epi," she said, her voice oddly calm. 1 milligram 4. Push it hard. Chen injected the medication directly into the circulatory system. Margaret continued her compressions, feeling the heart begin to respond under her fingers, feeling the muscle remember its job. The monitor above them shifted, a flutter, then another, then a pattern that began to resemble something close to a rhythm. Sinus rhythm. 82 beats per minute. The oxygen saturation climbed, 78, 82, 88, 92, numbers that meant the boy's brain was getting blood again, that his organs were receiving oxygen, that Margaret's hands had just pulled him back from whatever edge he'd been standing on. "Blood pressure's coming up," Chen whispered. His voice held something like awe and something like terror. Margaret withdrew her hand from Ethan's open chest. Blood covered her glove up to the wrist. She'd saved a child's life by doing something that would end her career the moment anyone found out. Her hands didn't shake. Her breath remained steady. She met Chen's eyes and said, "Close the pericardium. 4.0 sutures. You'll need precision." Then she began the work herself, her sutures perfect as surgical knots pulled by a hand that had trained on combat medics in the most dangerous places on Earth. Each stitch was a whisper of silk, each knot tied with the economy of motion that came from having done this same work in field hospitals while mortars landed outside. When the thoracotomy closure was complete, it looked like it had been done by a cardiothoracic surgeon with 30 years of experience. The sutures were nearly invisible, the tissue approximation flawless. Ethan's blood pressure held steady. His oxygen saturation stabilized at 96%. His heart beat on, rescued from the edge by someone the hospital believed was just a geriatric night nurse who folded blankets and checked vitals without complaint. The doors opened at 2:43 a.m. Dr. Caldwell stood in the frame, already in hospital scrubs, already moving toward the bed with the expression of a man arriving to pronounce death and fill out the required paperwork. His eyes moved from Ethan's monitored vitals to the surgical site to Margaret's hands, which were now bare and stained with blood that was slowly drying to rust color under the fluorescent lights. His face went through four expressions in 3 seconds: confusion, then shock, then calculation, then something colder than either. "What," he said slowly, his voice the temperature of a walked-in freezer, "did you do?" Margaret stripped off her latex gloves with a snap that echoed in the sudden silence. "The boy is alive. His output is restored. His neurological status is preserved." She disposed of the gloves in the biohazard container as if she'd just taken a patient's temperature. "That was the outcome we were working toward." Caldwell pulled her into the hallway. His hand on her arm wasn't rough, but the power behind it was unmistakable, the grip of a man who'd just realized he was dealing with something far more dangerous than a defiant nurse. "You just performed thoracic surgery. Without surgical certification. Without authorization. Without supervision. You're a bedside nurse." The boy was dead. Margaret kept her voice level, her gaze fixed at a point somewhere past his shoulder. "The protocols you've been following end in his funeral. The protocols preserve resources for patients with survivable outcomes," Caldwell said, his voice dropping to something that sounded almost reasonable. "That child was a resource drain. A paralyzed 8-year-old with no functional recovery pathway. You've just committed criminal negligence, violated hospital policy, and performed unauthorized medical procedures. You understand I have to terminate you immediately? And report this to state licensing." He smiled then, a thin, sharp expression like a shark showing its teeth. "You've ended your career. Congratulations on your principal." Margaret walked back to Ethan's bedside. She checked his pupils, reactive and equal, noted his oxygen saturation on the monitor, reviewed the cardiac rhythm now steady and strong. Commander Hartley was asleep in the chair beside the bed, his weathered hand still resting on the mattress edge, inches from his son. She didn't wake him. By 3:17 a.m., Caldwell was in his office calling the board chairman at home, his voice smooth as oil. "We have a protocol violation that requires immediate escalation. Geriatric staff member, unstable judgment, performed unauthorized procedures." The chairman's voice was inaudible, but the urgency was clear. A hospital's reputation depended on containment. By 4:42 a.m., the State Licensing Bureau had received a formal complaint alleging that Margaret Walsh had impersonated medical personnel, performed surgery without credentials, and demonstrated alarming signs of psychological instability. The complaint was filed as an emergency review, the kind that moved to the front of the queue. By 5:11 a.m., an external investigator was being contracted through a firm Caldwell used regularly, someone who understood how to audit charts in ways that created documentation of incompetence. Every chart Margaret had touched in 3 years would be flagged. Every patient outcome would be scrutinized for negligence. By the time the investigator was finished, Margaret's medical record would tell the story of a dangerous woman who should have been removed years ago. At 7:52 a.m., Margaret was summoned to the administrative office. 2 security guards stood outside the door. Caldwell sat behind an oak desk with the kind of power that came from knowing how to weaponize institutions. "Your badge and keycard," he said, extending his hand. "You're suspended pending investigation. 2 witnesses are here to document that you've been relieved of duty." Margaret removed her badge from around her neck and placed it on the desk. She'd worn that badge for 3 years, each shift a careful balance between healing people and remaining invisible. She set her keycard beside it with the same deliberate care. "Where did you learn combat surgical technique?" Caldwell's voice held a note of genuine curiosity now. A detective trying to understand his suspect. Margaret said nothing. "Answer the question or I'll file charges for impersonating medical personnel." "Who trained you?" The silence stretched between them like a held breath. "Who are you?" His voice had dropped to something almost soft now, and that made it worse. He knew. Not all of it, but enough to recognize he was looking at someone whose identity didn't match the file in his system. "Someone," Margaret said quietly, meeting his eyes for the first time, "who keeps her promises." That evening, she returned her scrubs to the hospital laundry. She folded the blue fabric with hospital corners, each crease razor-sharp, the motion muscle memory from decades of military discipline. Perfect. Flawless. The final performance of a woman who had spent 3 years being less than she was. She laid her scrubs on top of the folding cart, placed her ID badge on the pile, and walked out through the service entrance where the night staff wouldn't see her leave. The parking lot was empty except for the rain hammering the asphalt like applause for a performance nobody was supposed to witness. 3 days would pass before the world would learn who Margaret Walsh actually was. 3 days would pass before institutions would begin to collapse under the weight of what one man had tried to bury. 3 days would pass before the truth would arrive like a helicopter cutting through San Diego sky, and everyone who'd laughed at her, dismissed her, tried to reduce her to nothing would finally understand exactly what they'd been standing next to all along. But that night, walking across the parking lot toward her car, Margaret Walsh was just a nurse leaving her shift. The challenge coin Commander Hartley had pressed into her palm days earlier was still in her scrub pocket. She felt its weight as she walked, cold metal against her ribs, and allowed herself one thing, a single exhale that sounded like relief. She'd kept her promise. By 6 a.m., Dr. Caldwell was in Margaret's file with a red pen, documenting everything backward. Unauthorized surgical procedures. Misrepresentation of credentials. Dangerous deviation from protocol. He typed with the precision of a man building a case, each keystroke a nail in a coffin that wasn't his own yet. By 7 a.m., he'd called the state licensing board. By 8 a.m., he'd activated an external auditor. By 9 a.m., Margaret was in his office with security standing at the door like sentries guarding a tomb. Master Petty Officer, Caldwell began, and the title came out wrong in his mouth, a word he didn't understand. "Where did you acquire surgical training?" Margaret stood in silence that carried the weight of deployments and decisions made in rubble. She didn't sit. He didn't offer. "I did what was necessary." That's not an answer. That's evasion. His voice climbed higher, pressing for something he could weaponize. "Where?" "Training." "Institution." "Time frame." Each demand shorter, sharper, like he could puncture the wall she'd built just by talking louder. "We have protocols for a reason. Patient safety. Institutional liability. You performed an unauthorized thoracotomy on her. The boy would be dead without it. That's not your decision to make." She looked at him then, and something shifted in the air pressure of the room. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, the same tone that had issued orders in Helmand Province to soldiers who understood what that voice meant. You're right. That decision belonged to you. And you would have let him die to protect your metrics. The suspension letter was printed before noon. Unauthorized procedures. Misrepresentation of medical credentials. Endangerment through deviation from established protocols. Pending investigation by the State Nursing Board and the hospital's legal team. Security escort requested. Effective immediately. She didn't argue. She didn't cry in the laundry room or the parking lot or anywhere the building's fluorescent eye could see. She simply walked to her locker, removed her scrubs, 3 years' worth of night shifts folded in a metal box no larger than her forearm, and carried them to the hospital laundry, where a woman named Dolores worked the wash station with hands as efficient and invisible as Margaret's own. "I'm done," Margaret said. Dolores looked up from the industrial washer, understanding passing between them without words. She'd worked nights for 18 years. She knew what invisible meant. Margaret folded her scrubs one final time with hospital corners, the way she'd been trained, the way she'd done 3 times a week for 36 months. Fold. Crease. Align. Fold again. The blue fabric became smaller, more compact, until it was a perfect rectangle that could fit in a donation bin or a trash heap, the utility of it erased. She placed the stack on the counter between them, and Dolores didn't move to take it immediately. She just looked at the folded scrubs like they were a flag being lowered at dusk. "You coming back?" Dolores asked. "No." 3 days passed in the apartment where Margaret sat with the television on low volume, not watching. The rain came that afternoon, the kind that hammers asphalt like applause for something ending. She pressed her hand against the window, felt the vibration of weather, and felt almost nothing. Compartmentalization was a skill learned in deserts where emotions could get soldiers killed. She compartmentalized her compartmentalization. On the 4th day, the CNN broadcast hit the local news cycle at 2:02 p.m. The Defense Department press conference had occurred in a Pentagon briefing room she'd never seen but could imagine: oak panels, flags, the kind of institutional geometry that made small men feel larger. A general with 3 stars spoke about declassified operations, operations that had been buried in classification so deep that even their shadows were erased. The presenter clicked through a slideshow of decorated service members, 16 faces, the living proof of missions that officially never happened. And there was Margaret. 23 years old in the photograph, which meant the image was from 2001, which meant it had been taken at a ceremony she barely remembered. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, the caption read. Decorated medic missing since 2009. Missing. Not discharged. Not reassigned. Missing. As if she'd been erased from the official record so completely that her reappearance in declassified documents was a kind of resurrection. She watched her own face on the television screen and felt the rain still hammering outside, the sound of it vast and impersonal. The news anchor mentioned the newly revealed operations in Helmand Province. 3 Navy crosses. The anchor said it like she was reading from a script that didn't quite fit in her mouth. Margaret Walsh, the anchor continued, distinguished herself in combat medicine protocols that have since become standard training across the Naval Special Warfare Command. She was reported missing during personnel reassignments in 2009 and her service record was sealed until this week's declassification order. The camera cut to her apartment building by accident. Cedar Creek Medical was visible in the background of some footage. The press conference had been held in San Diego, and the local affiliates couldn't resist contextualizing the story with images of the hospital where that missing medic had apparently resurfaced. Margaret watched her workplace become part of a story she had never wanted told. At 3:15 p.m., Commander Hartley stood from the plastic chair beside Ethan's bed, where he'd maintained his vigil for 4 days without sleeping more than 40 minutes at a time. His son was awake now, breathing without the ventilator, sensation returning to his limbs like color bleeding back into a photograph. And his protector, the night nurse who'd appeared like a ghost at his child's bedside, who'd moved with the precision of someone trained in catastrophe, who'd given him a challenge coin that meant something he'd understood in the marrow of his bones, had just become a televised legend. He found Dr. Caldwell at the nurse's station reviewing charts with the methodical precision of a man who still believed his authority was unquestionable. Her code name was Shepherd 6, Commander Hartley said, and the words were quiet enough that only Caldwell and the nurse at the adjacent desk heard them initially. But then he repeated it, louder, the way a man speaks when he needs everyone to understand what they're standing in the presence of. Her code name was Shepherd 6. She led my team through 16 hours under sustained fire in a compound outside Sanjin Valley. She's the reason 43 of my people came home instead of in boxes. Harvey, the elderly security guard who'd worked the night shift at Cedar Creek for 12 years, who'd seen thousands of patients admitted and discharged and sometimes not, suddenly understood what he'd been looking at every time Margaret walked past his station. He stood from his chair, all 68 years of Desert Storm combat experience straightening his spine, and he saluted. His right hand moved to his forehead with the precision of muscle memory, and he held it there while the entire nurse's station went silent enough to hear the heart monitors in the adjacent rooms. Harvey spoke next, his voice steady as ordnance. That woman is a Master Chief Petty Officer. That woman has seen things that would break the people in this hospital into powder. And she came to work night shifts in a place that treated her like a ghost. By 4 p.m., a 2-star admiral had arrived at Cedar Creek Medical in a Navy sedan that looked less like a car and more like authority made manifest in steel. By 4:15 p.m., that admiral was in a conference room with the hospital board, reading from a file that had been classified since 2009. His voice filled the space like a physical force, each medal a sentence, each decoration a judgment rendered. Bronze Star, the admiral said, and the board chairman looked like he'd been struck. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. And 3 Navy Crosses. He paused after each one, letting the weight settle. 16 confirmed saves under fire. Operations that until 72 hours ago didn't officially exist. This woman served her country in capacities that most of you will never understand. And you suspended her for saving a child's life. Caldwell tried to speak, his voice small in the massive quiet. She violated protocol. She performed surgery without authorization. I was protecting. You were protecting your metrics, the admiral interrupted, and his tone made clear that he was reading that phrase from documentation, from Caldwell's own emails, from the record. You told the licensing board she misrepresented credentials. You contacted her references and pressured them to revise statements. You altered patient charts. You accessed personnel files using administrative credentials you weren't authorized to access. And you did all of this to a decorated service member while her record was classified so deep that half the military didn't know she existed. Caldwell's face went the color of medical gauze. I didn't know. How could I have known? You wouldn't have, the admiral said flatly. But that's not actually your defense. Your defense is that you committed federal crimes while attempting to cover up those crimes with more federal crimes. The FBI arrived at 4:27 p.m. on a Tuesday. Special Agent Reeves was a woman in her 50s with the kind of methodical presence that suggested she'd spent her career sorting through the wreckage of men's decisions. She met Dr. Caldwell in his office with a partner who had 2 intelligence patches on his suit jacket, the kind of markers that meant interagency protocol, that meant Margaret's case had escalated beyond hospital policy into something that required federal attention. Dr. Marcus Caldwell, Reeves said, not a greeting but a statement of fact. We're here regarding the falsification of federal personnel records, obstruction of a federal investigation, and fraud related to the certification of a Navy service member. She laid out the timeline with the precision of evidence. His emails to the licensing board. The falsified disciplinary records backdated in Margaret's personnel file, complaints generated after her suspension, incidents that investigation confirmed never occurred. The pressure applied to her references at the VA hospital in Coronado. The altered patient charts that suggested negligence where none existed. The hospital security footage showing him accessing restricted personnel files at 11:11 p.m. on a night when he shouldn't have had authorization. Each action, meant to build a case, had instead become a strand of a web that trapped him. You have the right to remain silent, Reeves said, and she continued through the Miranda warning with the rehearsed tone of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Do you understand these rights? Caldwell nodded, the movement small and automatic. They walked him out at 4:52 p.m., his wrists in restraints that caught the fluorescent ceiling lights, making the metal gleam. They moved past the nurse's station where Margaret had stood for 3 years invisible. They moved past the vending machine where 2 interns had made jokes about the old lady who thinks she knows better than Caldwell, the same interns who now watched the perp walk with their faces burning red enough to match the emergency exit signs. They moved past Harvey, who stood at attention, his hand at his forehead, maintaining the salute until the sedan pulled away from the curving driveway. One of the interns, the one who'd made the Grey's Anatomy reference, stared at the floor so hard you'd think the tile held answers. It didn't. The only answer was the one that had always been true: she'd known something they didn't. She'd been something they didn't recognize. The medical board revoked Caldwell's license within 5 days. The case went federal. He took a plea deal rather than face trial, the kind of deal that meant 18 months in a federal facility in Lompoc, California, where he'd have time to think about metrics and honor and the difference between them. When he got out, the hospital that had employed him for 12 years didn't rehire him. The clinic that had considered hiring him rescinded the offer. By month 4 of his parole, he was teaching CPR classes at San Diego Community College for $18.50 an hour, standing in front of people who mostly didn't know he'd once been a physician, reciting the steps for chest compressions to adults who'd never heard the word Navy Cross in their lives. Margaret heard about it the way people hear about small failures, secondhand, without surprise, with the sense that consequences were just the world's way of maintaining balance. She was in the pediatric hallway when the news reached her, helping Ethan Hartley take his first supported steps without the walker, his small hand gripping her shoulder while his father watched with tears that he wasn't trying to hide. The boy was 8 years old and smiling, the way children smile when they're discovering that their bodies still work, that paralysis isn't permanent, that the invisible nurse who cracked his chest open and reached into the machinery of his heart hadn't been wrong about him deserving to live. "Did you hear about Dr. Caldwell?" someone asked her, one of the residents who'd started at Cedar Creek after Caldwell's arrest, someone who'd never watched him humiliate Margaret at grand rounds. "I heard," Margaret said, and her voice carried no satisfaction, no bitterness, just the acknowledgement of a fact that no longer concerned her. Ethan took another step. Then another. His father's hand steadied his other shoulder, the commander and the nurse bookending the boy's return to the world. That evening, Margaret sat in her new office, Director of Emergency Medical Services, a position created by unanimous board vote, compensation retroactive to her suspension date, and she held the tarnished challenge coin under the desk lamp. The metal was worn smooth from being clutched during fire, from being held in moments when the only thing separating breathing from not breathing was one person's refusal to quit. She'd carried it through Helm and Province. She'd given it to Commander Hartley as proof that someone from before still existed, that his child wasn't alone in a hospital filled with strangers. And now it lived on her badge lanyard in the open, visible to everyone, a declaration that Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh wasn't missing anymore. She remembered the compound. The mortars. 16 hours of holding a position while the world burned around them. She remembered the order to disappear, to erase herself, to become invisible. She remembered folding her scrubs in the hospital laundry 3 weeks ago, the fabric becoming smaller, her identity becoming smaller, the reduction to nothing, a kind of death. And she remembered the promise. The one made when everything was fire and blood and the only thing that mattered was the person next to you. The promise that said nobody gets left behind. Nobody. Not ever. True heroism isn't what you do when the world is watching. It's what you do when you're erased, when your name is classified, when you're folding scrubs in a laundry at midnight and nobody knows you've saved 43 people who owed their lives to your refusal to quit. That's when it counts. That's when it matters. She pinned the coin back on her lanyard and returned to the emergency department, where a trauma case had just arrived by ambulance, where someone needed her hand steady and her judgment clear and her promise kept. The radio crackled with the incoming patient details: 19-year-old male, motor vehicle collision, crush injuries, ETA 2 minutes. The room moved into preparation, and Margaret moved with it, muscle memory and 23 years of experience converging into motion. She didn't need to introduce herself anymore. Everyone knew who she was now. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the standard against which everyone else was measured. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about the heroes who move quietly through the world, the ones nobody notices until everything depends on them. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value. And share this with someone who needs to know that real strength isn't about the title on your name badge.